If you go looking for this creature, you might want to start with the sea. Here's a look at the Mattel Master Universe Masterverse, the new Eternia Merman. With new Eternia shattered into thousands of islands, Mer-Man terrorizes everyone foolish enough to travel the oceans in search of Castle Grayskull. I wouldn't even bother threatening this guy that if he fails, he'll sleep with the fishes. Mer-Man does it anyways. Just before, of course, we get a closer look at the brand new Masterverse, new Eternia, and they wear pajamas too. The new Eternia Merman. First, the tape measure is going to tell us that the figure stands at 7¼ inches in height. That's, of course, factoring in the fins on the sides of his head. That translates to a figure that's 18 centimeters tall. Of course, if you are one of those collectors that prefer to collect your masters in a 7-inch scale, offerings are available from Mattel in the Revelation and Revolution based on the Netflix miniseries designs. There's also new Eternia, and I like new Eternia a little bit more because it looks like the classic design characters. One of the best examples going around right now is the Battle Armor Skeletor. Didn't know this guy existed? I did a review of him. Feel free to check that out after you check out the review of Mer-Man. From a size standpoint, Mer-Man isn't quite as tall as Battle Armor Skeletor, but he's about the same size as the new Eternia Triclops. He is, though, taller than the Trapjaw, which I guess you don't really want to have all the characters all be the same size. So he's about, like I said, he's about just a little bit taller than Triclops. He's certainly a lot taller, though, than Trapjaw, but he's about the same size as the new Eternia Faker. Faker is one of those examples where, yes, I know he still has a smudge on the top of his forehead. I have to get my hands on another version of Faker. Faker, surprisingly enough, the head sculpt worked really well for him, but it ends up making a really fugly-looking Thunder Punch He-Man. Still got to get my hands on him. We did, though, speaking of Revelation and Revolutions, we did get a couple of variations of Mer-Man there. We got one that was without the armor that you're not currently seeing right now. I never picked that one up because I knew eventually they would come around and release one that had armor. That had scars all over his body. The one that we got here was kind of the closest thing I had for a Mer-Man of a 7-inch, and he was my stand-in for the longest time. As you did see at the beginning of this review, as is the case with most Masterverse figures, the side compartment next to the tray contains a tiny little white bag. Inside that bag is all the wonders of the universe. Well, maybe not so much. You only get actually inside that bag a pair of replacement hands for Mer-Man. These are a pair of relaxed hands. What you didn't get, though, inside was his spear, and his spear was rattling around inside, and I actually thought for a second that something was broken on Mer-Man. Whoosh, wasn't the case at all. The hands themselves do represent one thing I did want to talk about extensively for Mer-Man, and that's the color scheme that they went with. Initially seeing what this guy looked like online, I was expecting really to get this guy in hand and hate the color scheme completely. Normally, Mer-Mans would have had something similar to like a yellow, and then of course he'd either have a blue or a green body. The colors, though, you can already see for his hands aren't quite green, they aren't quite yellow, they're somewhat meeting in the middle, and they kind of have this metallic, almost pearl sheen to it. It's a trait that you'll see consistently when we look at the rest of the figure's body. It comes with a pair of relaxed hands, like I said, you just don't want to replace out either one of these hands, just pop them off and replace them with these hands instead. Before you do that, though, you may want to just entertain the idea that the figure could technically hold either accessory or both his accessories with his hands. You may not even necessarily need those hands. Like I said, though, loose inside the tray was actually this. Well, it wasn't so much loose in the tray. It was loose inside the cardboard compartment space next to it. I thought for a second, like I said, something was going to be broken on the figure. The spear is very much something that looks a lot like the sword. They followed the motif of kind of giving him this, well, it's supposed to be like a spine or a bone of like an underwater sea creature, but the joke has always been made that it looks like a corn cob sword. They carried the trend here as well to the spear. I like the curve to the sword because generally the sword would just have been straight like this. Making this look curved like this definitely gives it a much more dangerous, gnarly look to it. I don't know if I would say it looks as good for the spear. I think it's one of those cases where I think the spear would have worked better if the point was just straight instead of curved like this. It is technically soft plastic. If I really was hating this as much as I sound like I'm hating it right now, I suppose I probably could just heat this up, bend it straight, and let it cool flat. Maybe put a couple of books on either side just to make sure that this is going to cool flat. The thing that's weird, though, about these accessories is that, not that he necessarily holds it, that's not a weird thing at all, but there is storage space on the back of the figure's body. If you spin the figure around, located on the back of Mer-Man's armor, there's a hole right here that he does have a peg placement right in his guard, right above the hilt, actually, of his sword, that just plugs this in place. Unfortunately, it plugs it in such a way that the sword, it sits really low on his armor. I mean, ideally, I would have really liked if the sword could have been plugged in here, but then it would have meant that you'd had to put a really ugly peg right there. And I wouldn't want to sacrifice the mold as good as it is for the blade just to put a simple peg right there. So this is the only peg placement that I could really even think of. And obviously, at least it gives him storage space. What's weird, though, is that they give him a storage space for the sword, but they don't give him one for the spear. You would think of the two things that the character would want to carry around in his hands, his sword being the first, the spear being the second. Yet, there's no peg at all here. Could they not have just done something similar to the sword? Had not put a peg right there so that, yeah, if you wanted to, you could have put the spear just like that. That would have made the most sense, and yet they just left one off altogether. Like I said, he does have it, so you can have him holding both things in his hands. So you can have the spear maybe in one hand, you can put the sword then in the other. If you really want to, I suppose, you can also have him holding the spear with both of his hands. The hand plastic, as it is pretty hard. Luckily, just with a little bit of twisting, it's very easy to get the sword in his hand, and it's also very easy to get the spear in his hand. Again, I like the curve of the blade, I just don't like the curve of the spear tip. I know it's a simple fix, I'm sure I could fix it with hot water. Let's remove those accessories. We'll put them off to the side. By the way, if you want to see what the hand looks like, if you want to change them out, you just hold on to the peg or just hold on to the forearm and then twist the peg of the hand until eventually you just remove it. Swap it out with the hand that you want to use. Whether you're an underwater sea creature or not, the thumbs will always go in. So that's what he looks like with a relaxed hand. This is what he looks like with the gripping hand. Exact same color scheme. Speaking of color schemes, get a good look at this guy's face. I was really, again, on the fence of really how much I was going to like this figure when I saw the images online. I don't really feel, honestly, that the images did any justice to the character at all. I think it looked way too metallic online. And I think also the color transition of the greenish yellow into this teal color, I think it looked a little bit more jarring online, that the figure looked like he was made of metal. He doesn't, again, honestly look as bad in hand. The head sculpt is fantastic on Merman. I love the fins they've got on the sides. His mouth, though, for a second I thought was going to have a hinge. It doesn't. It always is going to permanently stay open like that, which isn't really a bad thing at all. If they were to really put a hinge, it would mean they would have had to put this ugly peg on the side of his jaw in order for that to be accommodating. I'm just glad that they sculpted the mouth like this. I don't think it necessarily needed to have a hinge. Initially, I was kind of on the fence with the idea that they gave him fish eyes like this. So what it looks to be the case is that they probably put the pupils way back here, and then they put a lens of clear plastic over top of it. The fish eye look, initially I was thinking, I don't know, I'm not going to like this, because like all the characters up to this point have looked like action figures. When you start adding realism like this to Merman, I thought the figure would then stand out a little bit more, like a fish out of water. I'm here all day. But honestly, though, now in hand, I actually don't think the fish eyes look bad at all. Very much of a familiar-looking Merman face. In fact, we can bring in the Merman again we got from the Revelation line. I mean, to look at the two, it's definitely a lot more. It makes this guy even more stand out, like a cartoon representation of the character. You can see like his armor is handled well, that it looks more like the original classic design of Merman's armor, with all these large spikes jetting out the sides and sticking up the sides of his collar. The green color that, again, they've used isn't quite going to match the coloring of his face. I don't think it necessarily needs to either. The greenish kind of yellow color scheme is on the hands. It's also, again, on his armor, and it's wrapping all around the back of his collar as well. The green actually works. Again, I don't know what color you would call this, like a greenish yellow. Works really quite well, and it looks a lot better in hand than it did online. The only thing I would say is one thing that doesn't quite match in colors is when you're looking at the head sculpt and you're looking at the rest of his body. Clearly seems to be the case that there's a lot more blue in his body than there is to his face. There's a little bit here that's a little bit more resembling the face color, but there's a little bit of a divide where you can definitely see like the head sculpt's painted differently from the rest of his body. Speaking of the rest of his body, here's one thing that's rather interesting about Merman. Bringing in the original one here, there are things that they have shared between two, but it's not that they just moved one mold from one release of Merman to the other. There's actually some differences between them. If I was to lift up Merman's armor, for example, and I lift up this one, this is soft plastic, by the way, his abdomen area is exactly the same. Exact same sculpting. However, if you're looking at the top of his torso and the way they've sculpted his pecs, get his arm out of his way, you can see it rounds around here and there's a little kind of cut on the side. If you look at the new one we get here from Merman, he's actually got this little ledge on the side of his torso here. So what it looks to be the case is, even though they are using this part, they're not using this part from the original Merman. They've sculpted a brand new piece, which is really strange considering that most of his armor is going to cover over it anyways, but it's probably also so that they could sculpt something a little bit more interesting on the back of his body as well. You can see the original Merman wouldn't have had that. The new Merman kind of has these little rigid scales. If you want to take off the armor, I don't know why you would want to, but you could detach them here. There's just pegs on either side. You just remove that, remove that. I'm not going to remove it just because I know generally it tends to stretch the plastic and I can never get the armor back on the way it should be. So while his abdomen is the same, his torso is brand new. Obviously his head sculpt's brand new too. It looks like they've also used the same shoulders. They haven't, though, used the same bicep. This Merman's been working out. Look at the size of the guns on the new Merman versus the original one. Forearms are also very different from one to the other as well. The legs, from a thigh standpoint at least, seem to be sculpted the same. And the lower legs are also the same as well. Now, it's very easy, obviously, to pull this off because they're just sculpting brand new boots. Because essentially, like this piece here is just over top. Well, it's plugged into the top part of his calf. By the way, though, speaking of his boots, I really like the way they've handled these, giving them kind of like scales there on the front. All in all, like, it's a nice looking Merman. A lot nicer, honestly, now that I have the time and I've been able to see this guy in hand. If I saw this guy, again, photos only online, I wasn't liking the way they've handled the coloring. I thought he looked a little bit more metallic. He definitely looks a lot better, and he shows a lot better when you get this guy out of packaging. Now, for the figure's articulation, going back to Merman's stellar head sculpt. Oh, that's awesome. Head's going to rotate all the way around. It's on a ball joint. Even though he has this high collar on the back, there's nothing getting in the way of his head rotating. The head can look up, the head can look down, and you can also move it back and forth. His arms, because he's got the scales there on the tops for his shoulders, there's enough space right here that you can easily move his arms out at 90 degrees. Nothing getting in the way of those arms. Okay, maybe there's a little bit of things getting in the way when you try to rotate his arm all the way around. That's the only time you're going to find this rubbing up against the shoulder pads. He has a bicep swivel. Merman does have a double hinge on his elbow. And again, look at the sculpting on the fins here. Smaller on the top. He's got these larger ones on the bottom. The transition of the color definitely looks a lot better in hand than it did online. It's a little on the more metallic. It's a little bit more pearl kind of coloring scheme. But actually looks surprisingly a lot nicer now that I have this guy. Like I said, though, he does have a double hinge in his elbow. Hands rotate all the way around and hinge back and forth. Now, the upper torso is going to be on a ball joint. The lower torso, or the abdomen, will only be on a straight swivel. The loincloth is a softer plastic. Get a good look at the loincloth for those that like loincloths. And I love also the way they've sculpted the shell work here on this belt. Boy, that looks fantastic. Legs, those split out. You can take the legs and move them forward. Yeah, you can move them back. Sure. There's a swivel about 3/4 of the way up the thigh that allows the leg to rotate all the way around. Merman now still has a double hinge on the knee. The original Merman also had that as well. Swivel on his leg. He's got an ankle pivot back and forth, an ankle rocker back and forth. And like with the original Merman, who happens to share the same monster feet, he does have pegals on the bottoms of his feet. Merman, yes, Merman was one I was really excited for. I've always been big into this character. And I don't know if you guys can even see this, and I'm hoping this video's done this justice. Even with the way the light shines on this, he has, again, like that little bit of a kind of pearl mirror finish to it. It works, honestly, a lot better than it did when I first saw this online. I say the same thing again when it comes to the look of the character. It's one of those things where you really have to see it either in a video or you have to see it in hand. Sometimes, honestly, things can be distorted when you see the images of online of these characters. That Merman, I thought, honestly, I was really going to hate it. Not from a design standpoint, but I was really going to hate what Mattel decided to do with the paint scheme. Though now seeing it in hand, the figure does look a lot better than I was expecting. The transitions of this yellowish green then into the teal color of his arms worked really well. The fish eyes, which was also something I was thinking I was going to hate, I end up liking a lot more on the character. For again, the longest time, this Merman was my stand-in for the 7-inch scale. I think it's a prime time to have this guy retired in favor of what I feel to be now a superior-looking Merman. He's not 100% perfect. I mean, while I do like, again, his sword, and I think it looks a lot more dangerous now that he's got one that's got a curved blade like this. I don't know still why they chose to not make the spear tip straight. I can fix that. What I can't fix, though, is the fact that there was a missing absent peg on the back of this, so this could have at least plugged onto the back of his body. Why would they have done it with his sword and not done it with his spear? It makes no sense to me. Other than that, though, a perfect-looking Merman to add to the rest of my new Eternia line. New Eternia Merman definitely is one of those figures that you need to see in hand than relying solely of images of him online. Because whatever figure photos you see of him online, it seems to change the coloring of his skin. Those first figure photos we got from Mattel gave, I feel, a false idea that Merman was going to have more of a metallic finish to the plastic. While there is a bit of a pearl sheen, and it does add to the idea that this guy's amphibian after all, I don't think he's as metallic as Mattel would first suggest. I've also seen other online images from sites that sell Masters figures. And the images that they use give the idea that Merman has green skin. And that's not right either. Speaking of green, though, the one thing I do really like is the way they've colored his hands, the sword, and his armor. Not quite green, not quite yellow, meeting in the middle. The thing I also really like is that while he doesn't have gloves on the original vintage toy, the Lords of Power release of Mer-Man and the cartoon collection both have the character wearing gloves. So while he doesn't have gloves with this release, by airbrushing the arms the way that they did, kind of gives a suggestion that he's wearing gloves when he really isn't. The figure does also have very vintage-looking armor, very vintage-looking Cobb sword. The Cobb sword's a little meaner this time around, and this time there's actually a peg on the side of the guard, so you can attach onto the back of the figure's body. I wish some similar love was also given as well to the spear. I don't like that first the spear has a curved point. I can easily fix that. What I can't fix, though, is that there's no peg at all on the side handle. If anything was to be displayed on the back of his armor, it would definitely have been his spear, not his sword. If you're going to do it for the sword, you need to do it with the spear as well, and they didn't. The one other thing I thought was going to be something I wasn't going to like as much to the character, and I ended up thinking it's one of my favorite things about the character, is that he actually does have real fish eyes. Well, not literally real fish eyes, but they took clear lenses and they put it over top of his pupils, so it does add a little bit more personality to the character. Head to toe, great looking Mer-Man. What do you guys think of this guy? Let me know down below in the comments section. Have you guys been maybe on the fence about picking this one up? And maybe hopefully a review like this has helped a little bit. Also, as a little side thing, one thing I didn't even mention in this review, speaking of his armor, is I also like that they added a little bit of oxidization patina to the finish of his armor. Just nice little touches that Mattel added to this character. Yeah, really, if you guys get the chance, don't sleep on this. Don't sleep with the fishes. Grab Mer-Man now before this guy sells out. But let me know down below in the comment section what you guys think of this. Let me know also if you guys did enjoy this video by doing a solid, hitting it with a like. You guys want to stick around for more so? I hope so. Hit the subscribe, turn on that bell, come back please. As always guys, thanks for watching. See you guys next time.